Hello everyone, happy holidays, welcome again to episode 2 of the Ageless Art Podcast. My name is David Getson, and with me here today is Xene Abraham, and also new first time to this podcast, Bryan Mock. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you.
Hello, Xene. So this topic today, one of the joys of this podcast is to take the wonderful discussions that happen naturally and be able to share them out with a broader context and then hear back from people. And so today was the idea of something that I had been speaking with at the Vision 2020 conference, which is something that happened in Iowa City that Xene had invited both me and Bryan to, which was ideas about good constructive things for the future. And I was able to give a short talk with discussion about the shape of history, about how we can understand history as a process and its relevance to us today in many ways, but especially in art, because art transforms over time. So I was able to pack that into 30 minutes with some discussion. I think we can do even better than that. I want to give you guys, I want to hear what you guys are thinking about this. So I suppose I'll launch right into it. So a lot of this, what they call historiography, which is the study of the shape of history itself rather than the content. Interesting historiography from Oswald Spengler, independent historian, as they'd say these days, who came up with a book called Untergang des Abendlandes, The Decline of the West. And it was about how civilizations have a rise and a fall, or you could say more precisely how civilizations are like a plant organism, will have a period of gathering energy and a period of dispersal of energy, like starting in the winter, going through a springtime, through a summer phase, through an autumn phase, back to winter again. And there can be different world systems. There have been different what he calls world systems, because he considers it bigger than a given civilization. An example of this is that the Byzantines and the Arab Muslims, you could say they were different civilizations. Spengler said they were part of the same world system, which he called the Magian, because they understood the world in very similar ways, really. And the Western Europeans were the same way. They were also always at war with each other, but they had kind of a similar outlook to the world. And one of the most important things with this is the idea of there's the rising, the gathering of energy, which he called Kultur, and then there's Zivilisation, so culture and civilization. And he uses those, sometimes those words can be interchangeable, they usually are. He meant them very specifically. Culture, the gathering of energy, civilization is the dispersal of energy. Now, civilization is typically the time of empire, culture is the time of barbarians starting new things, and they can overlap with each other. We saw this with things that people popularly know about this is the Greco-Roman time, which he called the Apollonian world system, began with the early Greeks and then continued on, peaking with Socrates, continuing on through the Romans. And with each world system is a sense of understanding space and number itself. And this changes over time. The Apollonian understood space and number as body. Think of a column, think of a sculpture. The idea of infinity or vacuum literally frightened them. There's stuff in Plato about the horror vacui, the idea that the paradoxes of the pre-Socratics often had to do with infinity, things like Achilles and the tortoise, or Zeno's arrow, about how if you chop things up into infinitesimal steps, then it seems impossible from their point of view. Calculus, being invented by the Western Europeans, deals with that precisely, because instead of the Western Europeans, whom he calls Faustian, having the idea of body, they have the idea of infinite space itself. Think of the XYZ axis. We're all familiar with this. In fact, we're kind of too familiar with it that we don't perceive it all the time because we think it's just the way things are. It's a way of looking at things. So his thesis, his big argument in Decline of the West was that Western civilization, and this is a big anxiety lately, that Western civilization has come to a terminus, doesn't mean everything blows up. He talks about how subcontinental Indian civilization had its own peak and went and decline, but then just stayed really stable for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and that can happen. It doesn't mean the world ends when your civilization kind of runs out of energy. It just means that it's no longer generating something new. It becomes vulnerable to chaotic influence if things are changing quickly. Well, right now we have an old civilization. We have things that are changing quickly. Therefore, oh look, lots of people are confused and discombobulated. We should not be surprised. So then the task is to say, what do we think is part of new culture, if any? People have been thinking about this for some time. But that's...
Yes. Well, I used to tell the kids when I taught art, because I taught art for, 13 or 14 years, that the reason that, well, first of all, art was expensive, and there wasn't a lot of free time. So there weren't a lot of people that could take the time to create art. Mm-hmm. And so this wasn't something that everyone did. But the church adopted it as a way of them telling their stories. And so people could go to church and learn the stories of church from the walls inside the church, or the texts that the church would put out. So I would tell the kids that, this was really something special, that only special people could create art. And so that in some way would enthuse them to want to be able to do more art, which of course is my vision. But I'm interested in the idea of now we are kind of outgrowing that concept. Everybody can do art, and yet we're not, for whatever reason. And yet science proves now, so science is catching up and proving so many things to us that we had no concept of before. And so all of the things that we held to be a truth in the past are now being proven to be different than perhaps we were understanding before. And so we definitely need to be changing our concepts of history, of the future of civilization, because what we've been doing in the past doesn't make a lot of sense to our future. In some cases,
I would agree with that completely, because one of the reasons that this idea of the world systems makes a lot of sense is that it does make sense that there are times where a certain consistent way of looking at things is very helpful until it changes significantly. And those are the really challenging times, and it's quite clear that there have been the very significant changes already. And our technological capacity has outrun our mental or our spiritual capacity to have that growth and change. And I thought it was very interesting what you said about the accessibility of art. But maybe Bryan, you...
Yeah, well, this is what I enjoy about ageless art, and what you guys are building with it is building up that culture momentum that will then permeate, and then people hopefully will be making stuff, and then we'll have a civilization, or even just like a nice, beautiful culture would be great. Even.
Well, because I see it as a new renaissance is what we're needing, because the Renaissance was the unfolding of these pictures of church things in churches so that people learned the stories of the Bible in mass. And so what I see needing to happen now is another renaissance where everyone is finding themselves. They're not just adopting a story that was on the wall. They're finding their own story, and they're figuring out how they can create together. So I see a real need of more collaboration and more working together and more of finding yourself instead of trying to make yourself fit into an old story that maybe doesn't quite fit, or maybe has shifted in this new worldview, because now our story no longer is just what our parents taught us and told us, but now our story, because we have such a wide network, a worldwide network of connection, that we can be very close to someone who lived in India and understand what their story is and feel more connected to their story than the story that perhaps our parents taught us, which never was a thing even 30 years ago. You'd have to go to India, or this person from the other side of the world would have to come here for you to get exposure. Now, you turn your computer on, your Facebook, any of that, they're right there in your face. So our connections now, we need to be restructuring how we think.
Exactly, and this is one thing that is so transformative about how all that plays out, is one of the reasons I think things happen so quickly, is that people who want to find something unique or different, and this can play out in a healthy way and an unhealthy way, and we see it all the time, but you can find, you can definitely find it and reach out for the positive things that you want to connect with, and what would have either not gained momentum or would have taken a very long time to gain momentum culturally can now happen very, very quickly.
And that's getting back to your talk about the conception of space and everything in it informing your mind view and your view on the world, which Xene was sort of skeptical of, I think. But she's talking about even she's talking about it in the way we tend to see things in terms of fields, that there's different fields interacting with each other. So these different kind of cultures, the great mixing that is happening with all these fields interacting with each other. And then so for me, I see myself as I like this directed segment thing, like winding through and going through and twisting around through that whole thing and trying to figure out
This is interesting. I hope I want to just pause to bring that out more, to flesh that out more, because you're getting close to something I've been fascinated with, which is the concept of prime symbol. Yeah. We had mentioned these before. The body for the Apollonian was prime symbol. For the Gothic onward, it was infinite space. You are describing something which might be in that area, but for the way our minds are working now. I mean, you were talking about emergence, about the importance of, as Xene was saying, this social collective momentum, being able to find a natural direction, a natural structure. And so out of your conscious observation of that, you're trying to describe something. Now, Spengler talked about the Taoist, or the Chinese world system, as being heavily Taoist and being like way, the winding way or path. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're describing is unlike anything that he described for prime symbol. But if you can tease that out, what are you meaning by this winding path or the vector?
Winding kind of directed segment. I like that because it has that intersubjectivity to it. Okay. It has its own momentum and position, but those are also kind of fuzzy, and they can be influenced by other things as well. And so you can say I have my style, but really you don't anymore.
And for those of you just joining us, intersubjectivity is the realm between the objective and the subjective. Yes, folks out there in podcast land, there is a middle ground. So yes, go on with
which is becoming increasingly known and important too, that you exist and the world exists sort of on the skin of you or somewhere in between that area, and accepting that. So you're not being forced. Something's not being forced upon you by this great society and culture. You're actually part of society and culture.
Yes, you're a co-creator, an empowered co-creator.
Right.
Okay.
And having that permission, I guess, and agency is really nice when you get to that point. Because then you can just feel free, and it's no longer what does it look like, it's just how is it made.
Yeah.
But I think it's courage. I totally believe that if you're going to branch out away from parents and your society views, that you have to really be courageous. And I'm finding that more and more people feel that even just showing up for one of the events that we might hold, they tell me, well, it took a lot of courage to get here. Mm-hmm. I kept trying to talk myself out of it, but I knew I had to come. So I think I do think there is a significant amount of courage involved to just step out and make those decisions and recognize I do create my future by putting an intention towards a thing that I want to make happen and not letting myself be directed away from that goal. Mm-hmm. And so you set the goal in mind and you continue to work towards it because, well, for one thing, you have people supporting you as well. So when you need to find the group, find You need to find a way to change the history so that your past does not define your future.
And seeing feeling as sort of a field, feeling and intention as a field that you can also choose to navigate within. Like, you can have your good intentions put out there and make something from the good place, and it's usually a lot better than if you make it from the angry, bad, mad place where you
Always better.
Yeah.
Always.
I think the past, you put your finger on a really important raw nerve that needs to be touched in our culture, that the past not overly... How did you put that about the past and the future?
Oh, the past doesn't define your future.
There you go. The past doesn't define the future. Is that you have your own agency. And of course, it's part of a bit. You don't control everything about the future. You definitely have influence. And the better history is understood, your personal history, the global history, how your personal history interacts with the global history, the more free, I think, the more free you become to act in a harmonious forward momentum that you feel is best, and especially that plugs in to other people who are thinking the same thing. And I think that this courage is so important because that brings the art out. One of the saddest things about the 20th century is the legacy of the idea of the solitary artist. Because what is that for? If art falls in the forest and no one sees it, does it make a noise? Ridiculous description like that, you know?
Yeah.
Because art is for a bunch of people. It's for the person who makes it, and it's also for time going forward with other people.
Well, people think that because they aren't a professional artist, they're not artists. But it's ridiculous. People feed themselves all the time, and they might not be professional chefs, you know? But until they practice cooking, they won't get better at it. So the more you practice, there are elements of things that you can learn, and you don't even know what kind of food you might like at the beginning if you haven't had any. So, you know, if you've only eaten steak and potatoes, and you never branch out into a green vegetable, you don't even know what you're missing. Of course, there's a lot of people that don't like the green vegetable because they're so used to eating the plain old potato. What would happen?
Yeah, some chives.
Oh my God!
And it's the whole thing.
And this is the importance of all those art and architecture survey courses, which used to be highly valued but have sadly been either removed or defunded because people are going to be able to make decisions they're happier with, even if they don't like all that stuff. You don't like all that stuff that you're being exposed to about art and art history? Fine. Guess what? You're going to be happier. You'll be happier with where you are. And I did want to needle your brain, Bryan, a little bit about that vector thing. Because I think there's really something there. What were you trying to describe with that, and how were you describing it?
Definitely the agency part of it, having the ability to wander through and do things, the freedom of it, the people knocking into you as well. So the history part, I agree that we should be taught history, but it can also stifle you as well. So I'm kind of in that middle, in between space on that.
If it becomes a
as
self-conscious burden.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, as a style that you have, and now a style book. But there are patterns that you can pick through them, and then use and mix in your own way. And just seeing the world as full of possibility, I guess. It's not just sort of like a ground. There's grounds.
Bryan, are you describing a creod? CHREOD. For people who want to look that up, that means necessary path. It is a consequent concept of epigenetics, which means the stuff that determines what a life form is like in addition to the genetics, something that comes in dialogue with the environment. The necessary path means that there are many, this is five-dimensional thinking there, because they're not just time, but branching in time. So you have possible worlds.
Yeah.
The way that you think about time through the possible worlds is the branching.
Yeah, that's how I live. Yeah.
Okay, we're getting somewhere.
These possible worlds.
We're getting so you're thinking about a vector in terms of your own conscious decision making, negotiating its way through a flowing time point that is having decisions turn as possible worlds flow through the instant of now.
Yeah, so I mean, there's like everything that led into you. If you think about it as a family tree, it goes both ways. It's kind of horizontally, there's things fanning into you and things fanning out of you if you have children. But even if not, just interacting with the world, you still do that anyway. And how do you... Because not seeing yourself on sort of a timeline, but sort of just, like a path even, but that has many paths to it. And you can decide to turn around sometimes and go back home and live with your parents for a little bit too. If it's useful.
Okay. That's
not there anymore, but yeah.
That can be useful, yes.
Or, like traveling to Italy or doing a van life thing and then coming back to Iowa to do a van life thing with Xene even. So it's kind of a continuation, but in a different context, and seeing how that goes.
Well, this is also a new and different way of, maybe not new, but a different way than we're used to of understanding the Hindu and Buddhist ideas of recursion. That it looks like a permanent circle when you're standing on the end of it. But then if you pick your head up a little bit, you see it's kind of like a spiral tube, maybe with other threads coming in and out of it. And what feels like a dead repetition, you realize actually is different, although it's similar.
Yeah. Every time coming back here, I've been boomeranging back to Iowa several times. Further and kind of sort of further around. I've mapped it once, and it did make this really interesting shape, and I'm going to do another map. But, yeah, so there's something to that, I think.
Nice. Well, we are close to the end of our time here. This was another absolutely fantastic discussion. It makes me excited to hear what all of you would like to ask questions. You can send them to info@agelessart.net. We look forward to hearing from you, and there will certainly be more from us soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.